weren't for President Obama, we might not have done the intelligence community assessment that we did that set off a whole sequence of events which are still unfolding today, notably Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. President Obama is responsible for that, and it was he who tasked us to do that intelligence community assessment in the first place.
Hi, this is Pastor Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. This is an article from May 21st, 2012, and it says the NDAA legalizes the use of propaganda on the U.S. public. The NDAA legalizes the use of propaganda on the U.S. public. And I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from this particular article. And it reads, the newest version of the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, includes an amendment that would legalize the use of propaganda on the American public, reports Michael Hastings of BuzzFeed. The amendment, proposed by Mac Thornberry, a Republican from Texas, and Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington State, and passed in the House last Friday, would effectively nullify the Smith-Munn Act of 1948, which explicitly forbids information and psychological operations aimed at influencing U.S. public opinion. Thornberry said the current law ties the hands of American diplomatic officials, military, and others by inhibiting our ability to effectively communicate in a credible way. Now let me tell you why this is important for us to understand. When you understand the current atmosphere, if you will, of the intelligence agencies, you know, this Russian investigation, you know, all the what they call the fake news out now, and a lot of people are kind of torn between which side they're on. There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people don't really understand the depth of it. So let me break it down for you. So in Nazi Germany during the 1940s, the Nazis perfected what's known as propaganda. So with propaganda, they learned to use the media, movies, television. Well, they didn't have television, but the movies, the media, which was radio and newsprint. They also used marketing, like in banners and posters and different things like that, in order to promote their agenda. What propaganda is, it means basically to promote a certain agenda, to convince the public. It's a form of mass manipulation to convince the public of a certain position, especially when the government uses it. Now, you may not hear much about propaganda now because propaganda got such a bad rap during the Nazi Germany that they changed the name from propaganda to public relations. And there was a gentleman by the name of Bernays who actually perfected that. Propaganda is a way to manipulate public opinion to get the public to follow after what you want them to do. And it was more specifically used in regards to having a nation want to take people to war, wanting a nation to go to war. They try to sway public opinion by using propaganda to get public support. So in Nazi Germany, of course, the Nazis under Hitler, Adolf Hitler, they went to war in various nations, and they had the public support behind it. And so I guess what a lot of you would probably say, what does that have to do with us? Now, in 1948, they passed this law called the Smith-Munn Act, which forbid the United States government from using propaganda in order to sway public opinion. But in 2012, under the Obama administration, they repealed that law, and they now legalize the use of propaganda on the U.S. public. I'm going to read a couple of more excerpts from this article. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who released a highly critical report regarding the distortion of truth by senior military officials in Iraq and Afghanistan, dedicated a section of his report to information operations, or I.O., and states that after Desert Storm, the military wanted to transform I.O. into a core military competency on a par with air, ground, maritime, and special operations. So what they said is, you know, if you go to war, you send in air troops, ground troops, and naval troops. maritime, that's what you mean by what they mean by maritime, and special operations. So the Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, they're saying they wanted to use information operations or propaganda as a weapon that's just as effective as those other ones that I mentioned. Davis defines IO as an integrated employment of electronic warfare, EW, computer network operations, psychological operations, military deception, which is known as MILDEC, psychological operations is known as PSYOP, and operations security or OPSEC, in concert with specified supporting and related capabilities to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp adversarial human and automated design making while protecting our own. Now, originally, propaganda was only supposed to be used by the United States government on foreign interests or foreign entities. So, getting back to my previous point, in the 1940s with Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany perfected it. So, then moving forward, you had the what was called the OSS in the United States. The OSS later became known as the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency was supposed to be a entity. It's a kind of an extra governmental entity that was only supposed to use to spy on foreign nations and to be used against foreign entities. So for years, commercial advertisers and they would use, they would actually fund false information in other nations. They would paint a picture of dictators, and there's another book that talks about ex-CIA agent that talked about how they would overthrow dictators. So many dictators like Noriega, you had the Shah of Iran, you had the gentleman in the Philippines. I can't think of his name offhand, but other international dictators, what they would do is, before they would go in to overthrow them, they would start a propaganda campaign against them. It was the same thing they did with Gaddafi. They did it with Saddam Hussein, and of course, they came up with the narrative of weapons of mass destruction. They did it with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Fidel Castro, and I'm not suggesting that these guys were all good people, but you have to realize that what they would do is they would even manufacture stories to make them worse than what they actually were. Many of these dictators that I mentioned was actually put in place by the CIA, and then when they stopped playing ball, if you will, then the CIA started a propaganda campaign to paint them, to make them look like a really evil or wicked person, and then they would go in. They would either send in someone to overthrow them. They would start a coup from the internal a coup to overthrow the dictator, and then if that didn't work, then they would set a basis for war and send the troops in. And this is all documented. The CIA agents talk about this. Ex-CIA agent, a couple of them did documentaries and lectures talking about this. So anyway, getting back to IO, Davis quotes Brigadier General Ralph Baker, the Pentagon officer responsible for the Department of Defense's Joint Force Development, who defines IO as activities undertaken to shape the essential narrative of a conflict or situation and thus affect the attitudes and behaviors of the targeted audience, and equates descriptions of combat operations with standard marketing strategies.
Here are the facts. We've talked about propaganda before in our series on the infamous Edward Bernays, but what is it? The term propaganda comes from the Latin propagare. Originally, it applied to the Italian Congregazione de Propaganda Fide, or Congregation for Propagating the Faith. The modern definition dates back to World War I. Back then, propaganda was not seen as a bad thing. It was instead part of the war effort. But here's the second question. Is propaganda being used on you today? Here's where it gets crazy. Absolutely. And unless you're in a very isolated place, you are encountering propaganda every day. This can come in several varieties, religious, political, or commercial, but all of these types have a similar goal: to sway the viewer's mind, to convince you that their point of view is not just commendable, but indeed the only correct choice. The first large-scale propaganda campaigns in the United States occurred during World War I. These programs were run by the Committee on Public Information, an agency tasked with manufacturing domestic support for the war. Although this committee was eventually disbanded and the U.S. had no official propaganda programs during World War II, the administration worked around this constraint. Their answer? The Writers' War Board. This was a government-funded, privately owned organization that grew into what historian Thomas Howell called the greatest propaganda machine in history. A few years after the war, Congress passed the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948, better known as the Smith-Mundt Act. This gave the State Department the power to create media for audiences outside of the United States. Opponents said this gave the State Department the right to create propaganda. Concerned about this ability, especially after the actions of both U.S. and Nazi propaganda machines, Congress included several restrictions for the State Department. One of the most important of these was a prohibition on domestic use of propaganda intended for foreign audiences. While this distinction may seem difficult in a digital age where everyone with internet access is just a few clicks away, opponents of domestic propaganda feared that the State Department might begin presenting slanted international spin or public diplomacy as an objective truth. The Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012 brought these fears to the forefront. Supporters of bringing foreign broadcasts like Voice of America to the domestic audience argue that this creates more transparency and that this division between foreign and domestic doesn't make sense in the world of new media. Opponents claim this will muddy the waters of public discourse, already threatened at times by closed-door agreements between government agencies and large media outlets. Oddly enough, both sides agree that when it comes to propaganda, there's something the US government doesn't want you to know.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about the trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely
Dangerous to our democracy.
This is
Extremely dangerous. Dangerous to our democracy.
dangerous.
extremely dangerous to our democracy.
extremely
Dangerous to our democracy.
Now, what they do is they use marketing strategies. They use it's similar to an advertising campaign, but they use it in order to sway public opinion to get them to support their premise. And normally they did it as a way to justify going to war. For years, commercial advertisers have based their advertising strategies on the premise that there's a positive correlation between the number of times a consumer is exposed to product advertisement and the consumer's inclination to sample the new product. The very same principle applies to how we influence our target audiences when we conduct coin. Davis subsequently explains the cumulative failure of our nation's major media in every category as they continually interviewed only those senior U.S. officials who had top-level access, even as the officials given that clearance were required to stick to talking points given to them by Secretary of Defense. And at the time, this was when they went into Iraq, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, which means all of these officials that they would interview had to say the same thing. They had to stick to the same talking points. Again, they would do it. It was originally only supposed to be meant for foreign interest, but now in 2012 with the NDAA, they made it legal to use that against the United States public. I'm going to say that again. The NDAA of 2012 makes it legal for them to use propaganda techniques, also known as fake news or you know, along those lines, against the American public. Now, of course, in 1940s, the end of 1945 was the end of World War II, and the Nazis were disbanded pretty much. Germany was split into two. You know, the Nazis were supposedly disbanded, but only 19 Nazis were prosecuted for war crimes, and some of them weren't prosecuted until I think some in the late 80s was some of them were actually prosecuted. But don't quote me on that, but I know it was many years after it happened, and part of what I'm going to tell you now kind of ties that together. So they had this thing, the CIA had this thing called Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird was a secret campaign by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, also known as the CIA, to influence media. It began in the 1950s, and it was initially organized by Cord Meyer and Allen Dulles. You may be familiar with the name Dulles. It was later led by Frank Wisner after Dulles became the head of the CIA. The organization recruited leading American journalists into a network to help present the CIA's views, and funded some student and cultural organizations and magazines as fronts. As it developed, it also worked to influence foreign media and political campaigns, in addition to activities by other operating units of the CIA. Now, interesting thing happened is after Nazi Germany disbanded, the CIA actually brought in a lot of the Nazis into America. And they also helped to adopt many of the strategies that the Nazis used during World War II. In the early years of the Cold War, efforts were made by the government of the Soviet Union and the United States to use media companies to influence public opinion internationally. Reporter Deborah Davis claimed that in a 1979 biography of Katharine Graham, owner of the Washington Post, that the CIA ran an Operation Mockingbird during this time. Davis claimed that the International Organization of Journalists was created as a communist front organization and received money from Moscow and controlled reporters on every major newspaper in Europe, disseminating stories that promoted the communist cause. Davis claimed that Frank Wisner, director of the Office of Policy Coordination, a covert operations unit created in 1948 by the United States National Security Council, had created Operation Mockingbird in response to the International Organization of Journalists recruiting Phil Graham from the Washington Post to run the project within the industry. According to Davis, by the early 1950s, Wisner owned respected members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communications vehicles. Davis claimed that after Cord Meyer joined the CIA in 1951, he became Operation Mockingbird's principal operative. In 1977, Rolling Stone magazine article, the CIA and the media reporter Carl Bernstein wrote that by 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles oversaw the media network, which had major influences over 25 newspapers and wire agencies. Its usual modus operandi was to place reports developed from the CIA-provided intelligence with cooperating or unwitting reporters. Those reports would be repeated or cited by the recipient reporters and would then in turn be cited throughout the media wire services. These networks were run by the people with well-known liberal but pro-American big business and anti-Soviet views. So some of the people that they used were William Paley was from CBS, Henry Luch, Time and Life, the New York Times, the Washington Star, the Louisville Courier Journal, and Miami Herald, and the Christian Science Monitor. Now, why am I saying this? I'm talking about something that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But I need you to understand that that is the strategy that they have used, and they continue to use it even now. That the media is, a large portion of the media is an extension of the CIA and the intelligence agencies, and they use reporters, specific reporters throughout the industry in order to promote their agenda. 90% of all mainstream media is owned by 6 corporations, and all of those corporations are all tied into the globalist New World Order. The CIA is the intelligence, was one of the many intelligence arms of the New World Order, and so they promote the agendas of the New World Order. After the Watergate scandal in 1972 and 1974, the U.S. Congress became concerned about the possible presidential abuse of the CIA. This concern reached its height when reporter Seymour Hersh published an expose of CIA domestic surveillance in 1975. Now, recall, the CIA's original creation was supposed to be to spy on foreign entities, but they found that the CIA was also doing domestic surveillance.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to two American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole News and Public Affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
Congress authorized a series of congressional investigations into the agency activities from 75 to 76. So you had this thing in Congress called the Church Committee. And the Church Committee found unequivocally that the CIA was used and had planted newsmen throughout major newspapers, television networks, even Hollywood movie studios and network television had agents that actually worked for the CIA, and their job was to promote the intelligence agency's ideology. The Church Committee published a report in 1976. The report covered CIA ties with both foreign and domestic news media. For foreign news media, the reporter concluded the CIA currently maintained a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provided intelligence for the CIA, at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals. Now, as far as that was foreign. Now, as far as domestically, it reads, approximately 50 of the agency's assets are individual American journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations. Of these, fewer than half are accredited by the U.S. Media organizations. The remaining individuals are non-accredited freelance contributors and media representatives abroad. Now, also, so what they did is they also had leaks, what they call leaks. So because the CIA is interconnected in the government, if you know, currently they have a thing that they talk about a lot called the deep state. And so what they do is they in order to promote a story, they actually leak information, and they use their specific media sources to leak the information. If you recall, in the beginning of the President Trump administration, there would be constantly leaks coming out from internal sources, and everybody was curious as to how and why these leaks would come out. But when you understand Operation Mockingbird and the intelligence community, how they've used these tools throughout, it makes perfect sense. Even if you look at the whole Trump-Russian investigation, it was based on false news source. This Russian dossier that they found to be fraudulent is what they used to get a FISA warrant that give them the ability to tap into the communications of the Trump administration and those around them. So I need you to understand that this is not something new, that they've been doing it for a long time. So when you hear people question the intelligence community, especially as an African American, that we shouldn't be confused by it, because it's a strategy that's well documented. If you get a chance, you can look at declassified documents. You can look at the Church Committee, their reports, where the FBI director and the CIA director, or more specifically in the Church Committee, the CIA director admitted publicly, and it's documented, government documents show that they employed people in the media to promote their agenda. And a lot of the leaks that would come out, they weren't really leaks, they were actually fed to these journalists, and the journalists would publicly print them, and they would always say classified sources or anonymous sources, or they would say reputable sources inside of the administration, and then they would give this information. But what they found out was that these people were actually, it was the CIA and the other intelligence agencies that were leaking this information as a way to push a particular narrative. Because think about this, if you actually have a top secret clearance, or you work very close to the president or somebody like that, you're not supposed to leak information. It's it's only the things that you are instructed to release are you able to release. But yet they kept having all these mysterious leaks, and most people kind of they just kind of scratched their head and didn't understand what was going on. But I wanted you to understand and see, part of the thing is we got to peep the game. We got to understand the game and the strategies that's being used so that we don't get taken advantage of. And really, this is not about whether you like President Trump or not like President Trump. This is not about if you're a Republican or a Democrat or anything of the nature. But you should understand that there is a reason why the First Amendment gives freedom of the press. The reason that the First Amendment gives that freedom of speech and the freedom of the press is because of the fact that they understand that in order to keep a totalitarian government from taking over, or to keep the powers that be from completely controlling and oppressing the masses, they needed a free press. They needed freedom of the speech, freedom of speech for the American public, so that it holds the governmental officials accountable. So you got to recognize that we have a government that's supposed to be of the people, for the people, and by the people, that we don't work for the government is supposed to work for us. But because many people don't understand that, and because there are many of the same patterns over and over again, the American people, I believe, has been taken advantage of, and they're not understanding how the game works. And so this has been Dr. Joe Green, and I'm going to share some video clips as well so you can see some of the information. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and also my Patreon. And until next time, peace and blessings to you. I love you. Shalom.
Let's talk now about propaganda, the program by governments to manipulate people's thoughts and opinions. Right now, the use of propaganda by the U.S. government is only allowed when it's used in other countries. The Pentagon actually spends about $4 billion a year to sway public opinion in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Evidence that it can be a lucrative weapon when fighting a war, especially when part of that war is an information war. Well, now the U.S. government wants to be able to use propaganda on its own people. This provision is buried deep within the $642 billion defense bill and would give the government overarching power to push television, radio, print, and social media onto the U.S. public. But why?